Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jessica. Thank you for hosting, Linda, and thank you, Ian, for that excellent presentation before this. I'm sure you've all had the experience, especially as a composition student, sitting in a composition studio class. I'm going to say studio class. I've tried to stop saying master class. It sounds super pretentious that I am a master of anything. But when I say that, just know that if you call your studio a master class, I mean the same thing. And I'm sure you've all had the experience, both as a student and maybe as a person leading that, of hearing feedback that is well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Even someone who's here to tell you how great your music is or how much they loved it is often not going to tell you very much. You're not going to learn very much, and that makes it kind of frustrating because you don't have enough detail. You don't have enough information to know what was useful, what was good, what worked for them. And for that reason, feedback that your music is mind-blowing is just as unhelpful sometimes as feedback that your music was absolutely stomach-turningly terrible. And what I want to talk about today is some of the common limitations of the informal feedback process that I'm familiar with in studio classes, where we just kind of play and then talk. That unstructured, some of the limitations of that unstructured feedback system. And then I'll describe how I've used a version of Liz Lerman's critical response process, or CRP, to better support and motivate the composers in my studio, and maybe some ideas about how you might implement it in your own teaching practices. So in my previous experiences with critique sessions in studio classes, I found that the feedback offered usually said a lot more about the person who was offering the feedback than it did about the music to which they were nominally responding. Rather than suggesting how the composer might have written a work differently, this feedback often seems to answer the question, how would this piece have gone if I had written it rather than you? And while I do think there should be space for composers to respectfully challenge one another's creative intent, it's worth identifying what that intent was to begin with. A better feedback system should assume that each composer in the room has a different set of musical goals and experiences. An important secondary benefit of group feedback in a composition studio, at least in my composition studio, and this is a value that is important to me, is developing a sense of my studio as a creative community, and that studio is part of a larger creative community that includes the whole School of Music, the larger university, and the community beyond the university. I want the composers in my studio to want to support each other and collaborate with one another. My studio includes first semester undergraduate students and graduate student composers, and everything in between. In unstructured critique sessions in the past, the less experienced students often felt intimidated by the graduate students who were older and more experienced, and they felt like they just didn't have anything meaningful to say. As people in the very early stages of their studies, this didn't have a lot that was relevant to these students who they saw as, like, basically my age. When you're 18, anybody who's over 21 seems like they might as well be 60. And then the graduate students would often, correspondingly, unintentionally, with all the best intentions, they would unintentionally patronize or belittle the newer composers. They weren't trying to be mean, I don't think, but they would give feedback that would show that to these younger students. So another goal for these feedback sessions is to create a space for meaningful responses from anyone in the group, even those who are very new to music and music composition studies. I think critique sessions are an important way of building that creative community within my studio, giving them more perspectives other than just mine in lessons or whatever other faculty composer they're studying with. But I found that the feedback composers received in typical studio class critique sessions often backfired. It often made students feel less confident and less motivated to improve their work. So now that I've described some of the limitations of unstructured feedback, I want to give an overview of CRP, critical response process, slightly adapted to composers and my experiences implementing it within my studio in my studio classes at Wichita State University and elsewhere. So CRP was developed by choreographer Liz Lerman to help improve her work, especially during the workshopping process, which is a way more common thing for developing dance composition than it is for us in most of at least what I do in kind of our new music, experimental music world. Though this process is not specific to dance. As you can see, the subtitle of her first book is Dance to Dessert. My description will follow the process as Lerman describes it in her two books, both co-authored with John Borstel, the 2003 book, Liz Lerman's Critical Response Process, and the 2022 book, Critique is Creative. Just a side note, this second book actually came out after I submitted my proposal for this and before today, so I'll deal with it only briefly. Basically, it is a recap of everything that was in the first book, plus some additional contributions from outside authors about their experiences with CRP, a few of whom are actually talking about it in context beyond dance. So if at the end of this talk, this sounds like something you're interested in learning more about, I highly recommend both of these. You can get them very cheaply on Amazon or wherever you want to shop for your books locally. So I highly recommend either of these. So let's talk a little bit about the process. There are three main roles for people to play in CRP: the artist, the responders, and the facilitator. I'll use artist and composer interchangeably here since I'm talking specifically about doing this with composition students, but it could be performers as well. I've also run this as kind of a guest situation for my applied faculty colleagues before. The responders in my most common use case are the other students in the composition studio, but it could easily include other faculty, other students, other music students, or even non-musicians. It's actually really interesting to bring non-musicians into this process. The facilitator leads the discussion, and the critical thing that the facilitator also does, especially for groups that are new to CRP, is to kind of enforce some of the structures. There's kind of a traffic cop kind of role that the facilitator has in some of this process. So I'll explain the process a little bit more in a moment. If this is something you're interested in doing, I would encourage you to dig a little more deeply into the process itself and sit down with the composer or artist who's going to be presenting work in a CRP session to give them an overview of everything that's going to happen. And that should happen beforehand, maybe a few days beforehand, and then still give a pretty broad introduction to the group as a whole before the first time you do this, especially, again, if they're new to CRP. I've also found that the facilitator in many cases needs to temporarily kind of assume the role of one of the responders to model the sorts of engagement that you expect at different phases of critical response. So another thing that may be useful, especially if you have a really big group, like if we were doing something like this in a group this size, I might even ask somebody to volunteer to take notes. My studio tends to be around 10 or so students, so that's not necessarily practical or necessary, but for a big group that might be helpful to allow both the facilitator and the artist to focus more on the conversation as it's unfolding. So one interesting consideration before I get to the steps of the process itself is when during the compositional process to engage in critical feedback with a larger group in a studio class setting. I personally like to use CRP with works that are still in progress rather than those that are already completed, since it can be a pretty big challenge to take a piece apart and put it back together once it's already completed. And for all sorts of external reasons, like the need to prepare a senior recital or the need to get things ready for a deadline for some application or something, I'm sure you all have experience with this. Students may just not have the time to do the kind of reconstructive surgery of taking a piece completely apart and putting it back together and then still do all of the other things that they need to do in their busy academic careers. So for that reason, I genuinely avoid doing this with an already complete composition. At the same time, it's got to be more than a sketch because we need to have something that's substantial enough for the responders to respond to. So more than a sketch, but doesn't necessarily have to be a complete draft for this process to be meaningful. When presenting a work in class, I usually have students share a PDF of the score and an audio realization, and they do that in our studio Discord. We have a studio Discord chat if you have another way of sharing files with your students, whatever is fine. Sometimes a video is going to be relevant to the piece. Sometimes a live performance may be more relevant to the piece. And I know there are a lot of issues around relying too heavily on computer realizations, but I think in this particular circumstance, the benefits kind of outweigh most of the risks in using computer realizations. And I do discuss some of the limits of computer realizations with students, especially in the first few times that we do something like this. I ask the composer who's presenting their work to not say a ton about their piece before we get started to avoid kind of priming the audience. I want them to have a relatively similar response to what an audience would have, which is generally not with a lot of information going in. But I do ask them to describe what proportion of the piece they imagine we're about to hear. So for example, they might say, this is the first half of the second of 3 movements of a piece I'm working on for a woodwind quintet or something like that. So after that introduction, we listen to the piece, we follow the score, and then we begin Lerman's critical response process. So critical response has 4 distinct steps. We go through them in this particular order. So first, statements of meaning. Critical response begins by simply asking about what things the audience perceived, not necessarily what they liked or didn't like, or what, big giant air quotes, worked or didn't work. I ask responders to think about answering the very simple question, what did you hear? For example, they might say something like, I heard 2 distinct sections. Or they might say, I heard bluesy harmonies. Or they might say, I heard a Thelonious Monk quote, or whatever it is. Lerman even sometimes suggests that the facilitator frame more specific questions like what was meaningful, or what was surprising, or what was interesting. And these can be really useful in steering feedback towards things that are kind of relatively positive. And it can be tempting for responders at this stage to start to offer opinions. I liked something. I loved it when you blah, blah, blah. And in those cases, I try as politely and welcomingly as possible to cut them off. Because at this stage, I want to avoid giving a direct opinion. It's unavoidable that some amount of opinion kind of creeps in, but I try to catch the ones that are more directly stated. And to that end, I sometimes even will change the name of this step when I'm introducing this to students. Instead of statements of meaning, I'll sometimes just call it observations or even neutral observations to really lean into the hold off on your opinions for now of it. So the reason for avoiding direct opinions here is that the goal of this step is to show the composer how their work is perceived by a group of curious, generous listeners first. If the composer imagines there were 3 sections in what they played, but somebody says, I heard 5 sections, it's an opportunity for the composer to think about form, why they made the choices that they did, how important those choices were to their conception of the piece, and what they could do to clarify those choices to the audience. Once the responders seem to have run out of insightful statements of meaning, it's time to give the composer the floor in the next step. So step 2 is the composer as questioner. Lerman calls this the artist as questioner. I've mostly replaced references to artist with composer in this talk. So in step 2, the composer asks about specific elements of the work. This is the composer's opportunity to show what is important to them about the piece, or ask about how an element was perceived that the responders might not have thought to mention or ask about or comment on in step 1. So formulating these questions can be a little bit tricky, especially for younger composers who are still in many cases discovering what is important to them in their music. Right? This is for young composers, that's part of what they're doing is figuring out what's important to them, or at least how to describe what's important to them. Maybe they know intuitively, but they haven't put it into words in a clear way. I like to give a few guidelines to my students. First, when you're asking questions, don't solicit opinions. That's a really easy trap to fall into. There's time for opinions later. So I try to stop them if they say a question like, what did you think of this thing? Or Did you like it when I did this other thing? Second, I try to get them to ask questions that are relatively specific. In her book, Lerman warns against getting too specific, but I have not, at least in my experience doing this with my studio classes, found specificity over specificity to be a big issue. For example, a student might ask, what instrument did you hear as the primary voice in the introduction? Or what, if any, relationship did you hear between the first section and the second section? I even had a student one time ask, and I thought this was a pretty good one, can you sing back the main idea? Like that got some really interesting responses. So, by the way, if you ever want to stump a composer in a lesson, after they show you their piece, ask them what the main idea was. Blank stares. For facilitators, this is the step 2 that requires the most coaching in advance of the session that you do. As I said, younger composers may struggle to formulate these questions, so I'll usually discuss it with them in a one-on-one meeting or lesson before the day that they present to avoid putting them on the spot in front of everyone. And even for my more experienced students who have been through this process before, I'll still send them a note a day or two before just saying, hey, I know you're presenting in class on Thursday. Just remember, you're gonna have to do this thing where you ask questions. So be thinking about what a valuable, useful question might be for you to ask here. Much like step 1, step 2 focuses largely on the way a composition was perceived by an audience. The main difference is, again, that in step 1, the responders are approaching the music without guidance, much like most audience members. And in step 2, the composer guides some of that reflection through their questions, which shows some of what they found to be important about the piece. And the next step begins to address why the composer made the decisions that they made. And this is neutral questions from the responders. So we started with the responders offering their observations, and then next the composer asking questions, and now the responders are going to be asking questions of the composer. And they're going to ask questions about the creative decisions that the composer has made. So these can be super specific, like why did you choose to write mezzo forte in the alto clarinet part on beat 2 of measure 81? Or they could be very general, like why did you choose to write for alto clarinet entirely? Like that's a totally reasonable question as well. Or, and if you have people coming from outside music to this is a little bit related to something that Ian talked about before, like why are you writing gnarly chamber music when democracy is in collapse, right? That's a totally reasonable question as well. Right? If you want some really good questions, invite your musicology colleagues to this process. I've never heard a good answer to that, so if you have one, let me know. It's easy for questions from responders to have embedded opinions. So this is another time for the facilitator, for me, to be pretty active. Most of the time, a question that has an embedded opinion can be reworded in a more neutral form that asks the composer to still kind of reflect on and explain the same thing in their music, but doesn't invite them to feel as defensive as a more loaded opinion question might. So one of the goals of CRP is to avoid exactly that kind of defensiveness that might come from other forms of feedback. So instead of asking, why is the middle section so long, right? That implies that the middle section is way too long, what were you thinking? But another way you could ask that is to ask, how are you thinking about the structural proportions in the piece? Or what kinds of planning did you do for the form and the structure, and why did you use that kind of planning? There might be a very good reason for one of the sections to be much longer than the others, or there might not. If there is a good reason, the composer might want to consider ways to make those proportions seem more intentional or clearer. And if there isn't a good reason, it's more powerful for the composer to make that discovery on their own and look for ways to revise things about the length of the proportions of the piece. If your students are anything like mine the first few times through critical response, they might start to get frustrated that they can't jump directly to offering opinions, especially if you've used a more informal system before where they're used to just firing away with opinions as soon as the music is done. And that may eventually lead to a little bit of frustration, but I think The two questioning steps are some of the most meaningful parts of a CRP session, especially for composers who are earlier in their studies, because it helps them to discover, as I've said, what's important to them about the music that they're making. And it's only after everyone has kind of established what the goals of the composition were that these opinions become meaningful and that these opinions become useful. And that's when we get to the step that involves direct opinions. Rudman calls this permissioned opinions. At least for me, every application I've ever typed the word permissioned in, it gets a little red squiggly underline, but that's okay. This very last step of the process is the only time that we get to these really direct opinions, and even then, it's only in this very highly structured way. The step is the only one that has a specific script, and this is the script. It goes like this. I have an opinion about topic. Would you like to hear it? If the composer says yes, which is, in my experience, almost always the case, the responder shares their opinion. The topic of the opinion could be anything. They could say, I have an opinion about dynamics, balance, counterpoint, idiomatic writing, formal structures, whatever it is. They can have an opinion about it and ask for permission to share it. Lerman herself, in her writing, admits that this script makes this step a little bit awkward, but it has a lot of utility, especially in keeping the composer from becoming, defensive. Even if they say yes, knowing that they could say no puts them in control of the dialogue. And additionally, and this is the part that I think is sneakily brilliant, it gives the composer just a few seconds after hearing the subject of the opinion to try to put themselves in the mindset that they were in when they initially made those decisions. It makes them better prepared to receive the opinion, positive or negative, in the constructive spirit that it's intended, because they get a second to kind of prepare themselves for it. I think of it like a baseball catcher getting down in their crouch before the pitcher begins their windup. They're going to be far more prepared to catch the ball. By placing the opinions at the very end of the process, it ensures that the responders have a better sense of the composer's goals and that their opinions can be expressed more empathetically and have more useful implications for the composer. My students really respond well to our critical response sessions. They are almost always highly motivated to work on their compositions at the end of the session, or at least they tell me that. Maybe they're just being nice. In my experience, that seems unlikely, but maybe. And that's kind of the opposite of my experience with unstructured feedback before. It also lets them show their peers what is interesting and valuable to them, right? This is a way of kind of sharing what their musical values are in our community of composers and musicians. One downside that I will say, and this is a thing to keep in mind if you're interested in doing this, is it takes a lot of time. This process is not a fast one. In a typical 50-minute university hour, if the pieces are relatively short, because we're listening to the playback in real time, and students are already familiar with CRP, we can maybe do 2 in a 50-minute hour. With a 75-minute class, I find 3 or 4 to be pretty reasonable. And the first day I introduce CRP every year in my studio class, there's every year at least a handful of new people. And so I have to kind of start from scratch each time. The first day I introduce it, I only plan on doing 1 in class because it's a little bit slower and we spend a lot of time going through this and explaining why it's important. So the time is a really kind of one of the big downsides here. If you are in a circumstance where you need to speed it up, so maybe you're at the end of the semester and you want to give everybody a shot to get some kind of feedback, you can put a clock on each of the steps, is something that I have done before. If you've got maybe like a guest and you want to make sure that they hear as many different pieces as they want, that's another thing that you might do there. I've also found that if I skip the last step, permissioned opinions, maybe I'm not actually doing according to Hoyle CRP at that point, but I think students still get a lot out of it by going through the first 3 steps and bailing on the opinion step, which is funny because that seems like that should be kind of the crux of the whole thing. But I think students actually get the most out of the earlier 3. So those are, despite the time investment though, I think CRP is really valuable to my students, even when they're not presenting their own work. So that's another important thing, is they're learning a lot, even if they're not the one who's up standing in front of everybody. I think the greatest value of critical response, though, is in the structure and the dialogue. The structure separates the composer's intent from the intent of the responders. So critique changes from being about how someone else would have done it differently to being about how well the composer has defined and achieved their own goals. Through dialogue, CRP asks composers to take ownership over their creative decisions that they may not have even realized that they were making. By interrogating their own assumptions, it gives them the tools that they can use in their own work and on future compositions. So thank you so much for listening to my talk, and now if you have any questions.
The bad news is I think we only have time for one question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I talked for too long.
But the good news is that we have a break right after this, so we can continue the conversation. So I think I saw your hand go up first.
Thanks for a great talk. That was fantastic. I'm curious, with class time being the biggest constraint, it seems like with this, have you experimented at all doing this asynchronously or through any kind of other methods?
So I have not. I will say I have tried other asynchronous things, and it's mostly bombed. I do listening discussions with my students, and they often just don't do them. So it's something that I should probably try, but I've not tried this asynchronously, no.
Oh, okay, that was very fun. So I guess we can have a second question.
So speaking to this idea that you, I know, jokingly mentioned about, is it worth, why are we writing this music in this moment anyway? I'm recalling there was a graduate composition pedagogy conference that Mark Applebaum put together at Stanford a number of years ago. And at that conference, Martin Bresnik was talking about his teaching methods and saying, yes, one important thing is to establish what the goals are and whether you've achieved the goals, but that it's important for the teacher to interrogate, are those worthwhile goals? I don't know if that's the language that I would use, but I've found that to be largely absent in most processes of critique, and I'm curious what kind of responses you've got in those kinds of veins and how you guide the discussion when that comes up.
That's a great question. And I think this kind of, again, goes to Ian's framework of the levels of creativity. Like, so much of what we're doing is focusing on the ground level and maybe a little bit above that we often ignore the higher level questions, which are deeply important. And in the times when it has come up, the answers that I usually hear, at least from the students that I have worked with, have been very personal. Like, I'm writing this thing because it is often an extra musical thing. Like, it's a thing that I do in memory of a relative or something like that. I've occasionally heard students, especially who are working on more conceptual pieces, tell me things that are about social issues or political issues or something like that, but that seems to be pretty rare, at least in the students that I work with, which is probably my limitation more than theirs. But that's a really good question, and I should invite like more of my colleagues from outside of the music composition area, because those are questions that we're not used to asking ourselves that I think would be really valuable for our students to think about, even if they don't have great answers. Just to know that those are questions that people might have for them is really important. Yeah.